into what we do. And it was like, no, I can't be by myself right now, and I need to find people who are walking in this direction, and we need to do something. And this was a feeling that had been building for a while, but I feel like this was a moment when we started to define what the Citizens Laboratory did. And Valerie, do you want to talk a little bit about how that video kind of played into that process and how we were collecting information at that moment?
Well, like Amanda said, we were wanting to connect with people and feeling a little bit isolated from things that were exciting, that looked exciting from a very spectator's position in Egypt. And so we started to connect with some Egyptian art organizations, and one of them was the Contemporary Image Collective in Cairo, and their director directed me to this video, which is by an artist, an independent filmmaker who lives in Alexandria called Mario Makiwi and Nadine Khan, and I just thought that their perspective on how to talk about these activities was so right on. So that's where we're coming from. And so this was a piece that was included in an event that we did at the Oakland Museum. That we're going to talk about a little bit today.
But just to say that, you know, we have a studio process where we talk to each other almost every day. We're looking at these issues almost every day. A lot of what we do comes from words. And at this moment, there was all of this information flowing through the internet, and we felt like we need to actually like move through our own city and look for how this is happening and who it's happening for, and what's going on in our community related to this, because this might be one of the most important political moments of our lifetimes. So you guys can have a seat if you want. Amanda, can you play the video again? I think nobody could read the subtitles if you were standing. Oh, really? Yeah. Okay, we can play it again. Why don't we play it again on mute, and we can chat a little bit. Thanks.
هنتكلم عن الثورة. أنا قلت نبص على اللحظة اللي احنا فيها دلوقتي. هي لحظة حصل فيها انتصارات كتير، بس لسه فاضل كتير عشان نوصل.
Okay, we'll try it a different way. Jerome says, play the sound, it's really good. And I think it's worth watching. This is part of...
هتكلم عن الثورة. أنا قلت نبص على اللحظة اللي احنا فيها دلوقتي. هي لحظة حصل فيها انتصارات كتير، بس لسه فاضل كتير عشان نوصل. هي لحظة عظيمة عشان نعمل فيها أعمال جديدة ومختلفة ما كناش قادرين أو عارفين نعملها. بس قوة الميدان إنه ملوش ملكة، ملوش إطار يتحط فيه. ليه أحطه أنا في إطار أيا كان؟ انتصار فردي أو جماعي، أو في وجهة نظر عامة، أو في حكاية عسكري أو شاب أو حجرة أو شعار أو صوت أو شهيد أو دمعة أو كلها قصص جميلة وملهمة. هتطلع بس في الوقت المناسب، وقت ما أحس إن الميدان فعلا انتصر، وقت ما أحس إن فرصة التغيير اللي عندي دلوقتي ما بقتش فرصة، بقت حقيقة، وقت ما أحس إن الإنجازات مش مجرد سلع. متهيألي إني ما أتكلمش عن الثورة دلوقتي أحسن.
So, what does it mean that our world is changing? What does it mean that our world is changing there while we're living here? We started asking questions around that, just thinking, if we want to know, who do we need to ask? And in our inquiries, we started asking restaurant owners, corner shop owners, people here at UC Berkeley, and they said things like, do you know that every person in the corner stores around the museums and art organizations you're working with, I was living in Oakland at the time, is thinking about that, because chances are they're Yemeni or they have a Yemeni relative. and they're thinking about going home to support what's happening in their country. Do you know that like so many engineers, doctors, restaurant owners, merchants are thinking about what's happening in Libya, what's happening, and they're meeting and they're talking about it, and we thought, well, we want to be invited to that conversation, and have a little more connection about what's happening here in this community. So at the same time, Jerome had been in conversation a little bit with René de Guzman through the beginning of the Oakland Standard series of events at Oakland Museum. And Jerome, do you want to say a little bit about that conversation, or how that started?
Well, he invited us for open restaurant to be part of the conversation around this program called the Oakland Standard, and basically they got a big fund to bring sort of a new audience to the museum and develop what I thought was sort of public programs there. And then we started talking, and then he invited me to actually be part of a panel for the opening of that project. And so I was reading about the Oakland Museum, and so that it was built in the 60s as the Museum of the People. I thought that was pretty good. And also that was mostly financed by the City Hall. And I got sort of interested in this connection of these two major institutions. They're not that far from each other, and how do they connect? And so within the frame of sort of bringing new audiences and also trying to rethink a little bit what could happen in a museum, I started thinking about the citizens' laboratory and how a museum with this sort of institutional weight could become a place where art is not only consumed but also created. So we could create sort of an inner cell there, which I think what the Oakland Standard was, to bring artists to sort of rethink the city and rethink civic life. So I think that's basically how it happened.
I think one of the things about doing it at a place like the Oakland Museum is that it's a space where we actually can get help from the people who surround that museum. It's a big place. There's a lot of space in there. And the Oakland Standard, when we started talking with them, really is a program designed to invite new audiences into the museum. And, you know, going to that museum, you walk around and it feels like there are people everywhere. There are people everywhere to engage. And how do we sort of make the museum space into public space? Some of our major collaborators came from just 2 blocks away from the museum. It felt like almost our job was to start knocking on doors and start talking to people, which is what we did. And you know, this really was a project born of a particular moment, and we just took the steps necessary to get ourselves into the museum and to get people in there with us who could talk to us about this moment. On the left-hand side, there's a sign that was designed in collaboration with Ola El Khalidi and Diala Kassani of Makan Art Space. It was a connection through René that we found them. They run a contemporary art space in Amman, Jordan, and helped us with this very straightforward process, or not very straightforward process, of what we expected to be simple, which was designing the poster and talking about the elements involved. What does it mean to print this poster that says my address is Tahrir Square in the United States? What does it mean to take this title, April Fool's Night? And you know, we had been playing with how to bring people together, and we have been also given the date of April 1st, and we said, fool is the national dish of Egypt. Well, is there a way that we can bring all of these wise fools together to celebrate the exit of one particular fool?
Well, I mean, Just as a side note, we were invited as Open Restaurant to do a food event because there was a big food conference the next day. And because we were so taken by what was going on in Tunisia and in Egypt and everywhere else, we're like, it sounds kind of a little futile to do a food event, and that's when we proposed to do something around what was going on there. And so we sort of came in a little bit through the side door here and then sort of changed a little bit what was supposed to happen. But yeah, I think that was kind of an interesting or like an important thing of being able to, instead of saying, okay, we'll do food events and okay, what is this conference about, okay. Like suddenly there was this sort of really emotional moment and we couldn't stop talking about it. And so that's how it happened.
The space that we ultimately occupied was the garden at the museum. And this is a shot of the evening of the event. You can see on the left-hand side, people are paying pretty close attention to what's happening on stage. There's a stage set up. There's a video installation by an artist from Cairo. You can see posters are being made and strung up. There's a live Skype connection with artists in Cairo. And then on the right-hand side, a little further off screen, you'll see the kitchen that was set up in the garden. And one of our major advisors in the beginning, along with community members from Oakland, artists and curators who talked with us about what was going on in their home countries and sites. Nazar from Berkeley Center for Middle Eastern Studies sat down with Valerie and I and gave us a quick lesson on how Tahrir Square works. And this particular thing about Tahrir Square, which was that the revolution that happened there gave it its name. It was a square where before what happened this year, it had not witnessed a revolution. And this was actually the first moment that it came into its name. And he talked with us about creating a space that was as multiple and as versatile as that space in order to ask these questions. What is this moment and what does it mean for us? Do you want to say anything about meeting with Nazar or any of those details about the square?
He's also an expert on Egyptian architecture, on contemporary Egyptian architecture, and has written a lot about the space of Cairo, public space in Cairo, and hadn't been in Cairo. I think he was about to leave to go to Cairo at that point, but had been in touch with people a lot, and so gave us a good sense of what life was like there. And so in Tahrir Square at the moment when people were camped out and protesting, and then I think had a similar feel to what Occupy Wall Street is right now. People living in Tahrir and sharing food and singing, and the importance, and we discussed the importance of music in that space for people. So that became an important point that we played with.
And also public political speech, I think that was very difficult before that moment, and suddenly it became possible.
An idea that I've been sort of playing with in my mind is that we do offer these spaces for people to temporarily live in, which means discuss, which means eat together, which means have music and be satisfied in all the sensory and biological and political and social ways. The crowd ended up being fairly diverse. We had 3 kinds of fool, all of which were contributed recipes. Jordanian fool, made from cans, Yemeni fool, prepared by Mesa Restaurant.
And fool is fava's bean stew. It made in different ways. And at this point, fava beans were actually in season, so we had a kind of a California fresh fava bean stew that Jerome led us in making, and had a lot of volunteers who were very supportive of this event. And for all of our events, we rely on a lot of volunteer work.
It's a really sort of ubiquitous dish to the Middle East, and every country has a different recipe, and it's generally cooked all night and eaten for breakfast, and it's done with sort of dry fava beans as a basis.
And in Tahrir Square, there were, people brought full sandwiches a lot. That was a common meal that people shared there.
The other provenance of fool is that it was rumored to have been cooked in the king's bathhouse ashes every night, and that it really was a food of the people because it was people would come to the place where the royalty lives, cook their food, and so that was what we wanted to eat with people.
With sort of the recycled energy from the ruling class.
We also cooked 5 goats, and I put goats in quotation marks because it's an interesting note on sort of our cultural crossing with the people we worked with. We got them from Marwa Halal Market in Oakland, and the butcher was this incredible guy who worked with us to source the goat from Sacramento and from a halal supplier. And in the end, we put the goats on the spit and sort of got them ready, and Anthony, one of the cooks, said, "This is lamb from New Zealand." And so, you know, we had gone through this long process with him, and at the end, he was like, "Well, these are the goats, and this is the lamb, and I hope you have a fantastic time, and thank you so much, we really support you." And, you know, I think it's interesting. It's one of the parts of the process that's really interesting to me, that, you know, the priorities always surface, and sometimes we get to have a conversation about them, and sometimes it's an ongoing.
We should go through it,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, we're just about running out of time. So this was really meant to give you a sense of the evening, and I hope you'll ask questions afterward. These are the meals that people ate. We've got about 500 people. The crowd was pretty diverse, and we had the help of Nina Girgis from Zamboletha World Music School to create this sense of Zamboletha, which is the feeling you get when you're looking at something happening on the street. You don't know what's going to happen. You think it's probably going to involve you. It might be great, it might be terrible, and then you're part of it. And so that was his driving feeling. And one of the people he invited to help make that was Nada Shalabi, who came out for one night from Chicago and distributed Full with Jasmine. And you can see, this is not a self-publicity shot, but you can see that we were wearing the Full, and everyone else was too, because she was winding her way through the crowd, distributing these bracelets of paper jasmine flowers, which people do sell everywhere in Cairo. And she wanted it to smell like Cairo. Dunya Alwan led a poster making workshop with students from Berkeley High and UC Berkeley. They printed over 500 posters that night. One of the artworks that was commissioned was this video of the sun rising in Cairo as it was falling in Oakland. We're about 10 hours apart. So Taha Bilal videotaped the sun rising over his breakfast table with his mother as the sun was falling in Oakland, and we were able to project it onto the windows of the museum. Doa Ali and Taha both stayed up late to talk with people all night long about what they were seeing in Cairo. We had a panel of 9 experts who were taxi drivers, social workers, activists, engineers, doctors, all speaking from their own experience as people having grown up in Palestine, Yemen, Libya, Egypt, and the United States. It should be pointed out that here, I'm going to say their names because you might want to know them someday. Wafa Abu Rashid is the woman in the middle. Dr. Aftin Saba was there, Adnan Shanib, Mukhtar Al-Kanshali, Omar Dajani, Omar Kolani, Fred Lawson, Abdallah Nazar, and Omar Shakir. Abdallah in particular he's the next to the leftmost person here. And he flew up from LA. He was the subject of a video, or he was a participant in a video that his son contributed to the video program that showed in the galleries. And when he heard that this was happening, he begged his son and daughter to drive him to Oakland for the event, because he said, I should be there in Tahrir Square, but if I can't be in Tahrir Square, I want to be in Oakland. And they said, Dad, we can't do it. And his daughter called me and she said, I just was talking to my father, and now I'm crying because I feel like a bad daughter. We're buying him a ticket and we're flying him to Oakland. And so he came and talked about watching the revolution happen. They shared the stage with Tim Fusan, Mo Alilesh, and the Dooms, who at the end of the night performed a traditional Moroccan Ganawa dance, which is one that you do to get the old out and get the new in, or get out what you want to change and bring in what you want to change it to. They passed those instruments to the crowd, and they taught the traditional circle dance. And then after that happened, their band kind of slowly morphed into a Moroccan hardcore band. And they performed the song Zenga Zenga. And Valerie, maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
Zenga Zenga was a reappropriation or a remix of Gaddafi's speech, in which he said, we're going to hunt you down, speaking to the protesters, and we'll go house to house, street to street, neighborhood to neighborhood, and root out all of our enemies. And Tim Fusan kind of took that and used it as a call to protesters to come out and say, come on, house to house, let's go. And it was kind of an amazing hardcore moment of a mosh pit developed immediately after this Moroccan exorcism dance.
So
it's kind of a beautiful evolution.
So that's about 25 minutes. But I guess I just wanted to propose this event, and we chose to look at this particular project because it has kind of lain dormant this summer. There's an ongoing conversation with a lot of people who are involved, but we found ourselves sort of unable to move forward on it for various reasons. One of which being that one of our collaborators, her husband, and one of the panelists went to Libya and came back from the fighting. All sorts of things happened in between, but we are returning to this conversation now at this time when we actually might really need it. If we're really going to think about artists' roles in moments of change, like the Occupy Wall Street movement, I feel like this ongoing conversation is going to be really critical to us, and we do need to learn from these moments. So just as a question mark, what is it to consider duration in these projects, and how do we decide to continue?
Okay, thanks everyone. That was two really great presentations, and again, I'm Kenji Liu, I'll be responding. And I'm with the Geneva Carbon and Powerhouse, and I'll give you about 2 minutes of what that is, because I'm sure people are like, Geneva what? But before I do that, I just want to sort of name a couple themes that I've heard over these two presentations, as well as the course of the day, that I kind of want to bring out and pose again to the panelists as sort of things to talk about and to think about. One which is, one thing that I've also been seeing or hearing today has been this question of basically, I think earlier Joel Tan referred to it as being an insider and outsider kind of situation where artists oftentimes, if, you know, at a certain point in your career perhaps, you might have some kind of institutional backing or resource at your disposal. And so what it basically is the responsibility of an artist who has access to resources, but also still feels some sort of sense of responsibility or accountability to a particular community that they either come from or that they feel called to in some way. And so with that said, the question of how does an artist stay responsible, and you know, that can be anything from how you spend money to just kind of methodology in terms of how do you avoid or sidestep or try to question or think about the process of coming into a community or coming back to a community with resources and say, hey, I have this idea, you know, the top-down approach as opposed to the collaborative approach. So that's kind of one theme that I've been hearing today. And I think for the most part, I think I heard, you know, a lot of thinking about what that means, you know, from all the artists that I've seen up here. So that's one theme I wanted to bring out. And then the second theme, actually, I was really struck by that short film we just saw from Egypt, where the speaker said something about how when achievements are not just commodities. And some of the mention around the Occupy Wall Street movement that's in process now, and thinking also about life as living as something in a way that's a process rather than some kind of product. You know, what the question for me that comes out is, you know, how do you subvert the commodification of art, basically, you know, to put it simply, but in the sense of how do you subvert commodification because the purpose of the art that you're doing is not necessarily to make money, although that would be nice, right, sometimes, but to spark a process or to create a relationship or to improve a circumstance. And so that's sort of the other thing, right? When is art not just something that becomes gelled and solidified into a commodity, like an object, and when or what can you do to make sure that it doesn't just end there and that it can continue and grow and create change. So those are the two things I wanted to bring up, and that's a segue into the Geneva Car Barn, which I'll just give a few seconds on. Geneva Car Barn and Powerhouse is an organization in Southeast San Francisco in District 11, which is John Abelota's district. We're right next to the Balboa Park BART station. So the neighborhoods in the area, the Excelsior, Ingleside, Ocean View, Crocker, Amazon, etc. And basically, we have two things going on. One, well, the mission is to create basically a new arts and cultural space in that area, both physically as well as culturally. So we have an old building, a Muni building, former Muni building that was built in 1901, and we're in the process of turning that into an arts and cultural center for the area. And then the second part of it, which I'm more responsible for, is the arts programming, which we're currently doing in the local communities, but will eventually be housed in that building. And and both of these things that I was just talking about, the top-down versus collaborative process, and as well as the, you know, how do you fight the commodification of an art when that art is, when perhaps the value of the art is more in the process, are things that, you know, we struggle with too as an organization, because what we're interested in is sort of cultural community development, you know, where we invite high schoolers into these arts programs, not to turn them into artists necessarily, but because we want to try to help them to use art to address the circumstances that they're in, to help them tell their own stories, their neighborhood stories, and develop some useful skills in the process that can go on to help them in their professional lives. So in that sense, the question of, from earlier, high art or, like high technical skill perhaps versus, whatever the opposite might be. The goal is more it's more of a community art approach, right, where art is actually something that should be available for everyone to help them develop. So, so those are things that we struggle with. So, just to recap those 2 points, maybe we could start with you, Mark. You did say something about initially you saw that there was kind of a middle class presumption of, oh, I had this vision, but perhaps it's not quite going to work out that way. And so, what are some of the ways that you've found over time to stay accountable, basically, and to make sure that you aren't just coming in with a top-down approach?
I think that I believe in things that I don't understand. Stevie Wonder. The Church of Stevie Wonder. And less superstition, I trust my intuition. I also have been fighting. There's nowhere that I go that I don't question my authenticity in that space. I think that, it's an existential question. I think that it's a primary tension for most of us. Whether, I'm in a yoga class, or I take a West African dance class, or, I use chopsticks, I have a terrible sushi habit, you know what I mean? Like, these are all ways that as we cross cultures or cross boundaries, there's a natural struggle, I think, and a natural tension with authentic place, within the crossed boundary, within the transgressed or the transversed place. And I think the truth of it is that there isn't an answer, there isn't, we are not a monolith. I prefaced what I had to say by talking about hip hop and hip hop culture. And I'm 35, almost 36 years old. My grasp on hip hop culture, which is primarily a youth urban derived culture, is increasingly less authentic. So, and at the same time, I'm 35 years old. So me and my other 30-something-year-old friends all have some shit to say about, hip hop and hip hop culture. And so I am resisting, I think, as I get slightly wiser in my time, I'm resisting the urge to pass the purity test. I think it's something, you see it dominate our current politics. The politics of polemics are such that the middle ground is this forsaken, kind of barren, hellish place, that the idea of compromise or the idea of resistance to the absolute is synonymous with selling out one's ideals. And so, increasingly, I try to come from a place of personal integrity, and the pedagogue in me, the Freudian in me, responds to the notion that equal access through the provocation of multiple questions creates authentic space for all of us. So I resist this dynamic of I say, you listen, because that doesn't feel intuitively right to me. I seek to make art that provokes questions and also maximizes the potential for everyone to ask a question. Because as a 10th grade English teacher, I know that the successful classroom is one where everybody gets it. Not one where I'm just distributing content, but really one where, really a space where as many different types of intelligences are provoked, as possible. And this goes back to in the Life is Living space, the idea of safe space. You know, in the green sector, as we know it, is not safe space for under-resourced communities. There involves issues of class and terminology and capacity that just aren't present in these environments. And so where are the places for myself and for others, for other artist practitioners, where we can maintain our integrity through the provocation and through the asking of questions? And that's the space that I seek to occupy. And I think that I am losing the impulse to vilify myself for being imperfect, you know, or for not being perfect, you know what I mean, in my approach. I think that the authentic place, the accountable place, is in asking questions after the execution of an act, or after the event. So what we tend to do is do the event and stop asking questions, or we do the event and are very self-congratulatory upon the execution of the thing, upon the execution of the object, or the production of the exhibit, and that's where the inquiry ends. I think that if you continue to self-inquire, then we find ourselves in a more accountable place. And also, if your inquiry is then malleable, then changes based on the responses. I think, again, as part of the self-congratulation, we ask the questions, we execute the thing, and then we stop, right? If we ask the questions, execute the thing, and more questions change, and then our inquiry changes, I think that's a reflection of authenticity and accountability, because you're willing to change based upon what you hear, as opposed to having a prescribed response and only acting upon the thing that you wanted to hear in the first place. Yeah, so that's how I would respond.
Okay. Wow. How about over here? Is there anything in, for example, the experience with this project at the Oakland Museum, in which you were working with communities that you were not directly with or perhaps part of, and so were there any challenges around, you know, how these communities wanted to be represented and how you saw it and this and that?
Yeah, we've been talking recently actually about, you know, why would these people trust us? Why would they continue to want to invest in these questions? And I think it is because we come with a sense of curiosity and genuine inquisitiveness, and also because we're not only asking them we're not only not trying to speak for them, but we're trying to, we're not looking to them as some representation of authenticity. We're not looking to them to provide answers for us, but we're looking to them to try and collaborate with us and figure that out. And like Amanda was saying, those relationships kind of evolve over time.
I mean, I sometimes feel too like my home discipline is ways, and so we're exchanging ways when we're working together. And so, you know, it's a lot like social dance, where you like do a move and you see how it goes and whether your person is engaging with that, and if not, you do it again, different, and try something else. And I think that there's a lot of experimentation in the way that we work with people, so we don't always know the outcome. Like, preparing a presentation like this is murder for us, because it's like very hard to sort of plan it ahead. Everything we do is working actively until we get to that outcome. And so there's a ton of risk involved. Like, you know, do we know these people? How is our relationship working? Is something going to come in between? And I think, you know, that's why it's so amazing to be able to look back and see, like, oh, there was that moment when there was that mosh pit. There was that moment when, you know, Abdallah stood up and cried a little bit. You know, there are things that happened, and I think that all comes from this exchange of ways of doing things. You know, maybe cultural exchange is another way of saying it, but yeah, that that's sort of at the heart of what we do.
Jerome, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. It was kind of a strange process because we were so taken by this event and we're following on the screen basically, so we moved from it, and it was really, I mean, for me anyway, like about an emotion. I was like, well, I can't believe this is actually happening. It's like the real deal. And so there was a sense of like wanting to sort of touch that emotion, but with people. And suddenly we're like, okay, let's do this, and we have no idea who the community, the Yemeni community, or the Egyptian community, or the Tunisian community. We didn't know any of these people, and you know, there was a sense like, what the hell are we doing? This is strange a little bit. But it's kind of like the danger of it, and I think the danger of it is maybe what propels it forward and is going to create something that's going to be alive actually.
And the question to our collaborators really was, do you want to enter this space with us? You know, and if the answer had been no, things would have turned out very differently. I think we would have, you know, completely reconfigured our idea of how that event took place. But, you know, that fortunately has very rarely been the answer. And if the answer is yes, then we're gonna stand up for it and do what we can as artists to provide our skills to the kind of collective expression that wants to happen.
Well, and also like creating a space, sort of an environment that you can't really control either aesthetically or you're not sure what's going to happen. There's a panel, and there was a real sense that we wanted to have microphone in the audience and started sort of like a conversation between the panel and the audience and see what would happen. And you never know, you know, if it's going to gel, if it's going to turn into something, or it's going to fall flat and it's going to be uninteresting. And I think working like that it's kind of nerve-wracking, but it's interesting. I think it's you have to be willing, I think, to do this and to sort of jump into it and see what happens. And so far, it's worked. But
Now we open up to questions from the room.
Question for Citizens Lab. I'm thinking about some recent debates in art history and art criticism about the concept of relational aesthetics, the notion of the sharing of food, the creation of parties, the shared sense of conviviality is on the one hand, for some critics, a very productive mode of engaging with communities. That idea has also come under a lot of scrutiny and fire from critics who think that conviviality is just simply not enough, that that the earnestness there, the sincerity is, almost a kind of saccharine affirmation. And I'm just wondering how you would situate yourselves in that debate.
I mean, that's what I feel like, go ahead, Doc.
I don't necessarily feel like we're just creating conviviality, actually. I mean, I think, you know, we've all read those debates, and I feel like there is something valid in creating a space for political conversation that can be charged and not a polemic, and that's not necessarily convivial at all.
yeah, and I think the table is a great place to start that, and I think it's maybe that's a good place to start practicing democracy, and so conviviality, maybe,
no, that's a
but
good
not
point.
necessarily,
I would say that-
it's a lubricant. I think it starts things. It's not an endpoint.
And I would say that something that we don't often put direct emphasis on, but which we're always looking for, is the identification of conflicts and sometimes the resolution of conflicts, but that there is work to be done, and we're interested in creating spaces where that work can be done. You know, and I think maybe that's not to say that work doesn't happen in open restaurant, but I think that part of the Citizens Laboratory is asking what work can be done in the realm of civic and public life. How can we actually, as groups of people, do things and become more, and especially things maybe as nuanced as become more engaged, have richer political dialogue? So those are pretty vague demands. So it seems like it calls for specific kinds of encounters to make that happen. So the specificities for us are like a plate of full, a roasting goat, or a particular dance, but hopefully pointing toward conflicts which are also particular.
I have a question, but I'm not really sure exactly how to verbalize the question. But it has to do with the subversion of commodification that you were talking about, especially within like hip hop culture and the commodification thereof. How do you feel? Because I feel like there's a polarity within like hip hop between like the mainstream hip hop and then the more conscious hip hop, and I feel like the Life is Living movement that you're talking about is on one side. How do you feel that you can open up a conversation between the two polarities? Because like hype, I feel like is so hard to break down because it's under control, whatever. But.
Sure. You know, I had heard, seriously, I heard that the porn industry is actually larger in terms of economic scale and impact than mainstream Hollywood. Did you know that? That's what I heard. You can check me on that. You know, in our kind of reefer madness style way, I think that we misapply the term mainstream to corporate controlled music and broadcasting apparatus. I think mainstream is a misappropriated term that fools the rest of us into thinking that we're actually in the minority, when it's not true. There are diminishing audiences. There are diminishing record sales as accounted for by the corporate structure all across the music industry and certainly across hip hop. But that doesn't mean that folks are buying or consuming less music or have just abandoned culture altogether. So I think that there, is like the Clear Channel, Cox Media, just kind of focused on headline stories, music, ideology, and practice. But there's a deeper truism about the consumption of culture. And that truism is that the so-called underground actually represents the majority of consumers and listeners in this country. So in terms of kind of this conflation of these poles or the elimination of these poles, I think that it's so much less about responding to the quote mainstream or responding to corporate culture or corporate dominated dissemination. I think it's just about being collectively brave and speaking the truth, which is that we're the majority. That's the crazy thing about the 99% about claiming numbers. I did this this presentation this morning, and the person that did the visual landscape for the presentation urged me to say that such and such a show did 100 performances in 15 cities, rather than say it was in 15 cities for more than 100 performances. He urged me to put the higher number first, and I think that that psychologically that made sense, right? And there's something great, saying we are the 99% is a much more effective tactical branding practice than calling yourselves the Tea Party, You know, 99% actually does speak to populism in a certain kind of way. So, you know, what we try to do with Life is Living is just to illustrate sustainable survival practices. What you didn't see in the video was that the stage was bicycle powered, it was solar powered, that we had Brian Terry doing, you know, food education, and there was a green redesign of West Oakland that was done by middle school and high school students. What you didn't see in the video was it actually was an environmental fair. We just cloaked it in lots of music and visual art. You know what I mean? So what you claim, how you codify, and I think the bravery to claim yourself as the majority, or to claim ourselves as the majority, is how this these misappropriated terms get reconciled. It's how we gain strength from one another.
I'm trying to figure out a through line between the thing that you're talking about and the thing that you guys are talking about. And the one through line was like there were a lot of people outside. You both had the capacity to bring that there's something inside of the practice that has the capacity, kind of administrative capacity, to get on Skype, figure out the who's who of these relationships, develop the relationships with the organizations, and then get people to the Oakland Museum and get people to Discovery Park. And I'm curious about the machines necessary, the back machine necessary to make, if we were to call this art, to make art happen requires these other machines. And I think we both have that. We both have big machines that we don't see. I'm really curious about how those. You mentioned volunteers. If you could both talk about your machines.
Yeah, I think first the Oakland Standard was very. The small group that was running this project was really helpful and really supportive, and they were really part of. We all did this together, actually.
Well, and even more than that, they're working within a framework that allows the museum to wrap around projects really differently. And it gives the museum employees, and like Stain's sitting in the audience, so we're talking about him. It gives people who are creative and smart artists the agency to do that work as their paid work. And I think that that's important for the artists who get to work with the museum, so that there's a common language, and that common language can extend to include parts of the community that you want inside the museum, or just in our case that we want to talk to. So there's that.
Yeah, and also, for example, for like the musicians, we met Mina Curtis with this Zamboletha school, and said, hey, you want to do this? And he was like, yeah, that sounds great. And we just took it on, and basically we didn't have much to do after that. We just brought everybody and tried to talk to him, and we couldn't talk to him, and like everybody showed up. And so I think one part of what we try to do is really create sort of a place for people to feel it, and actually like backing as much as possible out of like, say, we want this or we want that, or just kind of here organizing the general sort of structure of it maybe, and just enough. I mean, there's a fine tension between sort of control and chaos, and I think the more we can sort of play on that it feels like an event, but at the same time we don't want to control all the moving parts so it stays alive. Is kind of is an interesting process.
And I guess I would just add to that the fact that all of those pieces, the collaborators from the community, the audience, the artists, absolutely wouldn't have come together at a different moment. So, you know, it came together under this overarching proposal that we actually care about what's going on in the world. And, you know, talking to Fatum, who's helped us make the meal that we're going to eat and make together tonight, and who's been very active, she was like, you know, we this is not the moment to work on this. This summertime, not an interesting time to do this. Like, let people have their moment with this. And, you know, there's a feeling between, or on her part, that maybe it's time to think about it again now, over the fall. But that a large part of the work for stuff like this happens because people actually care about this stuff.
And also, I think you bring up an interesting point. I think like the three of us each have different areas of kind of expertise or places that we're coming from. And so we bring those kind of networks or
Bodies of
with us. And I'm always kind of weirded out by calling myself an artist, because what I do in Citizens Laboratory isn't really all that different from what I do in my day job as an arts administrator. So it's a pretty fluid kind of process, those kind of logistical planning processes.
I think it's also important to mention the amount of trust, because that's really what, with a small group, because the event came together with a relatively small group, and because there's a high level of trust, you don't waste energy on that part. So everybody's walking the same direction, and like Mark mentioned before, it's like you have time to question what you're doing later on, but now you're going and move forward. So I think it was
lots of volunteers too. Yeah. Definitely.
A couple other throughputs that I saw, which I thought were really great, I guess I'd say one was improvisation, and another was messiness or contradictions. And you know, in a lot of senses, those are often thought of as kind of anti-intellectual practices, but in fact, you know, a messy office is a sign of a really smart person. But the messiness point is worth pondering for a moment, because you know, we spoke earlier about dualisms and how we want to fight against them, but yet we've also seen evidence today about how polarities and dualisms are also very motivating, and our politicians have exploited them a great deal. And even the questions that came from the audience were almost all phrased in terms of this or that, high or low, community or fine art. And Mark in particular, I think, pointed out that, you know, it takes constant vigilance to keep ourselves from falling into the trap of dualism. I mean, a number of recent theorists have talked about the expression a reverse discourse. You have to, instead of answering the question, you back away from the question. Or in the case of what a lot of you have done, is reject the question altogether. And so, yeah, you know, if it's not a goat, move on, you know?
I think your comment brings up these notions that come up again and again for us of alternate efficiencies and alternate resources, and thinking like how can trust be a resource, and how can we make it work in our favor? How can volunteerism or curiosity be a primary resource to what we do? And then also thinking about, like, what if the efficient way isn't the fastest way? What if it's the most collective way? Or conversely, like, do we need to get a full consensus from every person in this room, or are there other ways to do it? And just, trying to avoid the kind of either or approach to those questions.
My mama told me if you ain't got some haters, you're not really doing very much. So I love haters for that reason. And it's, I talk about the jazz gene, and I like that word. I love that adjective, messy. Like someone tell me that John Coltrane's music isn't messy, and then also tell me that he's not a genius. So I can call you a liar to your face. John Coltrane, so many artists make messy things. Pollock made messy things. and there's genius in that. There really is. So to, I know we're prone to respond to order in a particular way and symmetry in a particular way. That actually isn't human, not fully. I think the full experience of being human is a little mess, So it doesn't mean like, I'm not saying let's just all trash this place and, play Nirvana. I'm not saying that, Rage Against the Machine or whatever, but I am saying that a healthy dose of thrash works.
Well, I think it's the only way it works. If it's messy,
Yeah.
if you don't get dirty, you're not living, I think.
And I think that's really an interesting thing to explore a little bit, because I think one of the things all of you share is a certain willingness to ramp up the danger, the messiness, the risk. When you start an event, you really don't know necessarily what the outcome is going to be in it. I think it probably goes through a complete transformation from beginning to end in a pretty big way. We were talking about early this morning how we talk among ourselves, but also in the broader community, as we might define it, with communities that may not be as close to us as our own, or how we talk about this as the value that we bring, allowing this place where people can get messy, can engage in difficult discussions. And you alluded to this a little bit in your talk. We asked her about how we talk to the organizations that support us, how we convince them to fund us, how we define value. I mean, I know there's a lot of work going on in the outer world now about the economics of trying to evaluate social impact and trying to create metrics around saving the environment so that you can convince a business to invest in environmental practices or whatever. And, I wonder if any of you want to talk about how have you been changing the way you talk about what we do to allow a freedom in your work?